This first episode is on the game Raspberry by Jeremiah12345 as is their Scratch handle, or Moxie High as they go by on YouTube. The basic concept for the game is that you have a little character who can play through different mini-games. The version that existed prior to making this video was very bare bones, with only the obby in anything close to a state of completion, with the chill place and the zombies game both works in progress, and the only other thing that the game had was the ability to change your skin. The first thing that I felt that this project needed was a thematic through line to tie together all of the visual elements. The game's name is Raspberry, so I decided to lean into that as the theme, replacing the simple square player with a raspberry for their default skin and creating a variety of fruit themed skins that you'll be able to unlock later. There's a strawberry, a pineapple, an apple and a watermelon, and I think these are a bit more interesting than the simple colour swaps that we had before. I remade the menu buttons in the same style with the bold outlines and going with the raspberry pink instead of the sky blue that was there before. I opted to use handwritten lettering rather than one of Scratch's fonts because I think that Scratch's fonts are pretty ugly. They have their places, sure, and I have a couple projects where I've squeezed them in, but as a rule, no. It also didn't sit right with me with how some of the pages were navigated to with buttons on screen and others with keys on the keyboard, so I made it that all pages have their own buttons, and I condensed these down into a single sprite with clones for each button instead of having one sprite per button as there was before. But this snazzy UI was never going to look right against those backdrops, so I had to bring those up to par. I actually quite liked the existing style of the light background with the darker bars down the side, so I just recolored those to use the pink colour scheme that I've got going here. And for the title page, I rewrote the title, and the eagle-eyed of you might notice that I actually misspelled the title. I do catch that before the end of this little project, but it did take me an embarrassingly long time to do so. I created a play button to go onto the main title page and got that to display, and then got the menu buttons I made earlier laid out as I wanted to. I gave the buttons a juicy little mouse over effect and made it so that clicking the play button takes you to the menu page. And then I moved on to the character customization page, creating a button for each of the skins I made at the top of the video. Again, condensing this down into a single sprite rather than having each one be a separate sprite as it was in the original project. Another change in my version is that unlike Moxie's version, where all the skins were available from the get-go, in mine you have to buy them with coins that you'll be able to earn in the mini-games. This is to give the player something to work towards. So for every skin except the basic raspberry, I had to make a second costume to display the cost, and for this I had to design a small raspberry themed coin icon. Once these costumes were done, I was able to get these to display on the skins page, and I coded it so that these buttons can detect whether or not the skin was unlocked, switching to the appropriate costume. To get these buttons functional, I had to add money, creating the UI to display it as appropriate, and I made my own UI for this because I'm not letting Scratch's ugly little variable boxes anywhere near this project, thank you very much. And with that done, I could code in buying the costumes or equipping them if already bought. I also made a back button to take you from the skins page back to the main menu. Next, I sorted out the chill place as it was called in the original version, or the town as I renamed it to in mine. I made it so that it displays a grassy floor against the sky with a few bushes, creating 3 different versions for this to allow the player to navigate to different areas of the town. I made it so that the player can appear and jump around the area, and the platformer engine was definitely one of the original project's strong suits. I was able to use it with almost zero modification, so great work there. I also decided to add some buildings to the town, starting with 3 fruit themed ones in the first area. There's a peach house, a raspberry house and an avocado house. With the exception of the raspberry house, which presumably belongs to the player, there's a small character next to each looking like whatever their house is, so a peach character lives inside the peach for instance. I got these houses to display before making houses for the other 2 sections of the town, one of which has veggie themed houses, a pumpkin, a cauliflower and a carrot, and the other being junk food themed with a burger, french fries and ice cream. With the exception of the raspberry house, you'll be able to buy these houses, so I also had to make a locked version of each house with it displaying how much it costs to unlock it. Once you unlock a house, it will constantly generate small amounts of money from taxes, and I coded it in so that clicking a locked building unlocks it, assuming you can afford to do so. I then moved on to the mini games. There are 2, Obby and Zombie. As these were the only 2 mini games in the original project, these are the only 2 I'll be adding in today, but Moxie, if you wanted to expand the game further, adding more mini games would be a great way to do so. For the Obby, I wanted near infinite content to allow the player to earn as much money as they wished without having to make an insane amount of levels. So I designed a set of super simple levels, and you just have to complete as many as possible in a time limit, with it selecting a random level each time you complete one. And the fact that you quite frequently get repeat levels is actually a bit of a feature, not a bug, as the practice allows you to get better at the game and earn higher scores. I added bounce pads to some levels, as this was something a lot of the levels had in the original concept, and I also added doors which are opened with buttons to add a bit more variety. And you complete the levels by reaching the flag. It's a bit of a jolt if you're thrown into the game as soon as you select Obby from the menu, so I added a 3-second countdown to the start of the game, and I added UI to say game over once the time is up. I made it so that the UI that usually displays your money displays the time remaining during the game and your score once the game is over. And I created a replay button if you want to give it another go, as well as a home button to take you back to the main menu. For Zombie, I started off by creating a basic arena for the player to jump around. I got that to display, and once I got that looking good, I created a sprite for the zombie, which I tried to make look like a moldy version of the raspberry. And then I made some basic AI for the zombie, or zomberry, I don't know. But either way, it moves towards the player, and if the player is above the zombie, it jumps to try and reach them. It's really simple, and the zombies aren't smart enough to like pathfind around the platforms or anything, but it will serve. I also gave the player the ability to shoot. In the original, this was done with the space key, so I kept that, but I also made it so that you can click to shoot because that just feels better to me. And I made it so that the zombies spawn in, and so that the player can kill them, and so that they can kill the player. The objective of this minigame is to kill as many zombies as you can within the time limit without the zombies killing you first. I then went through and added in some sound effects to things like the menu buttons, the player's jump, the minigame countdown, using pitch shifting on any sounds which are played a lot of times in the row, like the jump, to stop them from becoming brain-meltingly annoying. And you can't talk about sounds without talking about music. I threw together a quick track in Soundtrap, but I'll admit I didn't put in quite as much effort as I could have done, mostly because Moxie told me that they already had someone who'd help them with that, and given my musical skill level, I'm sure they can do a better job. But I think I got something that's good enough, so I threw that into Scratch and got that to play on a loop. From there, it was just a few polished details. For instance, I created a description for each of the menu options when the button is moused over to give the player an idea of what they can do from that page, which could be useful if they aren't familiar with what an obby is. I swear I've never heard that term outside of like Roblox. Or if something like zombie isn't enough to give them a clear idea of what a game entails, or even that it's a game at all. And I also made some instructions for each minigame to appear during the countdown, and created a thumbnail for the game, keeping it quite simple, but I still think that it's really effective and punchy. And with that, I was ready to release the project. I think that it's quite the transformation, but that the spirit of the original is still in there. This was super fun, and I'm really happy with how this came out. The one I've chosen for this episode is Grape Soup by Samo Hamo. The original game basically involved going around and collecting ingredients, with you needing these to make soup, unlocking different endings based on what you throw in. I like the concept, but I felt like the game didn't read particularly well. There's a lot going on, and there wasn't much to indicate what I could or couldn't interact with. So if I was trying to improve this, I knew that I'd want to streamline everything down and neaten everything up, while trying to keep the core of a point-and-click style game where you're making soup. I started by basically purging the game of sprites and backdrops, giving me a nice blank slate from which to rebuild this game before jumping in with some art. I drew in a soup bowl, going with an almost paper-esque drawn art style, with bold black outlines and the majority of assets being white and pale grey, with only items that I wanted to draw attention to being in colour, and shadows being done with cell shading. I chose this art style because of the stickmen that the original game used for its characters. The overall style wasn't particularly cohesive in the original, and I had to select what of it I wanted to use as my springboard, and that was what I chose. I added a spoon and created a stirring animation to play whenever a new ingredient is added to the soup, and made it so that the colour of the soup can change as you add these ingredients. My hope is that these details make this key gameplay mechanic feel appropriately punchy. I then made art for the first potential soup ingredient, which is of course the titular grape. For this, I coloured the main fruit part in a bright purple, as that is the part of the sprite that I wanted attention drawn to, and I left the stem in white with a grey shadow. I made one version of the fruit whole, and one with some of the grapes picked once you've collected the ingredient. I then coded it so that the grape spawns in, and so that you can click it to add it to an inventory list. But having it in a list is all well and good, but I needed UI to display everything that you had collected. So I made this, creating a row of 5 squares that will act as a hotbar with arrows that will allow you to scroll through your items if you have more than the hotbar is able to display. Once I had that displaying as I wanted, I created an icon for the purple grape item, and made a clone of these for each square on the hotbar. I made it so that the item hides if the inventory list is too short for it to be needed, and otherwise switches to the costume of whatever item it represents. I also decided to recolor the picked grape sprite to be entirely white, and to remove the poppy mouse over effect from the sprite if the item is already in your inventory, to make it clearer that you've completed the interaction with the item and it no longer requires your attention. Then I made it so that you can drag an ingredient from the inventory to the bowl in order to add it to the soup. When this happens, the soup changes colour to reflect the ingredient, and it plays the stirring animation. I created a sprite for an offer button, which will allow you to submit your created soup, and I coded this so that it appears if there's at least one ingredient in the soup, giving it a little mouse over effect for some juicy punch. I then sorted what happens when you offer up your soup, making it so that it simply fades to black. For certain soups, the first time you make them, it will play a short cutscene to progress the plot. And for this, I needed to create a sprite for the first character in the game, the Grape God. I based his design loosely on the Greek god Dionysus, crossed with some Hindu god aesthetics with a bit of Lovecraftian deity thrown in for good measure. He's a real mashup of designs. And once I had him drawn and coloured, I had to make sprites for all of his dialogue boxes. I drew in the letters by hand to make sure that they fit the art style for my game in a way that none of the default fonts would. The first cutscene comes with access to a kitchen area, creating a sense of expansion and progress, so the dialogue had to reflect that. And with all that created, I coded it so that the dialogue appears, waits until the player clicks, and then fades out and in again with the next costume. I also made a screen for if the player resubmits grape soup after the cutscene has already played, as well as one for if the type of soup isn't recognised by the game, so if the player just adds a random combination of the ingredients that don't go together. This is called strange soup, and I programmed it so that the appropriate screen and cutscene appear based on what is in the soup. And then it was just expanding these features with more ingredients, more rooms, more soups. I'm not going to talk too much about that because I don't want to just wind up giving you all of the solutions. Go and play it for yourself. But I will talk about some of my thought processes. In terms of inspirations, there was the cupcake mini game from Moshi Monsters that came to mind, if any of you are familiar, where you have to make different cupcakes to tempt different moshlings to come and visit. And I was also partly influenced by those Rusty Lake cube escape games, especially in the visuals of the style, just with grapes instead of demons from your past, you know? There's only one path of correct answers in this, but if I was to expand this game further, having different options or routes wherein you make different soups and unlock different characters to get different endings would be a really fun way to do that. So, Samo Hamo, if you're watching this, that would be really something to consider. I do like what I've done with this game, but it does have a very different vibe from the original. It's cleaner, where the original was wild and upbeat, mine is serene and somewhat a bit unsettling even maybe. So I wouldn't be surprised if some people actually prefer the style of the original, but my logic was how can I remake the project in a way that I would most like to play myself, and this was my answer. Something simple, minimalist, but with the same core mechanic. Once I had finished the main story, I created a start screen, and I kept this super simple, with nothing but the game's title, a bowl of grape soup, and a start button, which I gave a basic mouse over effect, and made it so that clicking causes a fade in to the start of the game. And then I went through and added in sound effects. Some of these I pulled from my previous games, and others I just took from the extensive Scratch library. I used paper sounds from going to new areas, almost like you're turning a page in a book to go with the paper-esque aesthetic of the art, and I added various pops and clicks for whenever you mouse over or click different items and buttons, just for a bit of extra satisfaction. And then onto music, which, as many of you watching will know, is not really my forte. There was music in the original version, but A, I don't really know the copyright status of it, so didn't want to use it in my game, and B, given the complete tonal overhaul, the upbeat rocky music no longer fit at all. The new track is an echoey, unsettling violin and piano line in a way that's a bit haunting, as you, the player, sink deeper and deeper into the grape god's cultish grasp. And after creating a super simple thumbnail with the title and soup image from the start page, I got the project shared. I really hope you like it, although like I said, I'm sure that some of you might actually prefer the bright assault on your senses upbeatness of the original more than mine's peaceful serenity. In this video, I'll be making over River Jumper by GameMaker33 after a quick poll on my Discord told me that you wanted to see an endless runner. So if you want a say in what I make, I would highly recommend you joining the club. And if you want to see your project appear in this series, there is a submission form also in the description. As for this project, it certainly needs a lot of polish. The biggest issue is that for the life of me, I can't seem to get the player to jump, making the game more than a little difficult. And there are some issues with the platforms overlapping, which looks a bit messy, and I just feel like it could use some sprucing up visually. I started by going through and deleting any scripts that already existed to give myself a bit of a blank slate before creating the art for an infinitely scrolling river. This is comprised of 2 clones, each with a different costume that creates a seamless loop. This meant making sure that the art for the bottom of each costume lined up perfectly with the top of the next. For the art style, I decided to go for a cartoony style with bright colours and lots of gradients for shading, kind of inspired by the visual style of Subway Surfers, as I believe that game was an inspiration for the original River Jumper project. The biggest difference being that Subway Surfers uses 3D assets, and I'm of course working in 2D, this being Scratch. And then I made the art for the first type of platform, a small log. The platforms in the original felt a bit disjointed, with logs, planks, life buoys, and God knows what else. So I decided to streamline things down and settled on making everything jungle themed. And I animated the log to look like it's churning up the water behind it as it floats down the river, before implementing the code behind their generation. I coded it so that there's a constant flow of rows of logs with 1 to 3 logs per row. Doing it like this means that you're never in a situation where there are no logs to move to, and also so that the logs don't wind overlapping, and also so that the logs don't wind up overlapping with each other, which looks a bit messy. And the longer the game goes on for, the faster the log generation and movement is. And then I created the art for the player, who I designed to look like an explorer from the top down. I animated them running and coded it so that they can appear and move around the screen, switching to the correct animation, facing the correct direction as they do. The original game used the arrow keys for movement, which I did keep, but I also added W, S and D controls, as that's how I personally prefer to control games, and presumably there are other potential players in the same camp as me. I also made it so that you can jump, creating an animation for this as well, and I made it so that if you either go below the bottom of the screen or fall into the water, the game ends and the platforms and player disappear. And in order to round off the primary gameplay loop, I made the game over screen, which I designed to look like the flowing river with an explorer's hat floating in the water to indicate that the player has met a less than fortunate fate. There's a wooden sign that proclaims game over, and getting the letters to look like they're curving around the rounded logs was fun, let's say. And then I went through and made sure that the death code all worked, with everything disappearing that needed to, and switching to the game over screen. I then started adding variety to the platform generation, starting by adding in larger logs. These are functionally the same as the small logs we already have, except they're twice as long. Modifying the existing art for these was super easy, and for the code, the only slightly difficult thing was making it so that once it spawns, the second tile it occupies is also considered blocked, so another platform can't spawn in that space and thereby overlap. But I managed to figure it out and get it working as I wanted. The next platform type I added was the crocodile, and how this works is that it is something to avoid landing on. I really struggled with the art for this. Evidently I don't know how to draw crocodiles from above, but I managed to get something acceptable, I'd say. And for the generation, I had to make sure that any row of platforms of the crocodile has at least one other platform as well, to make sure that the course is always navigable. And I had to make it so that the player dies if they're touching the crocs. I then added in boat sections, which is basically just bits where you can hop in a boat and rack up points for a bit. It's something common enough in most of these endless runner style games, and I wanted to add something like that into this. I made the art for the boat, and for the generation it had to spawn a boat in the center of the row, and then have a few rows without any platforms, and then a complete row of small logs where you'll disembark from the boat. It was a bit fiddly, but I was able to MacGyver the code that blocks the spaces in the big logs generation code to create the empty space after the boat, and then I had it run a check to see if the next generation has to be a complete row, and if so, it gets those logs all spawning in. I also had to make it so that the player can actually get in the boat, so I made it so that the boat detects if it's touching the player and then tells the game that it's now in boat mode. I made an animation of the player sitting in and rowing the boat, and because that's all housed in the player sprite, the boat platform has to disappear until the player disembarks, when it appears in the water behind the player. And I made it so that the player switches to the boat rowing animation and doesn't die from falling in the water when they're using a boat. And the final type of platform I added was the cracked plank. These are pieces of wood that break away if you stand on them for too long, and for these I needed to create a version of the sprite at like 4 different levels of crackage, so to speak. So the plank at base, then starting to break away, then really cracked, and so on. And the art for this, it wasn't hard, and I wouldn't even call it tedious per se, but it did really take quite a long time to do. It was quite detailed and was a bit fiddly. Getting these to spawn in though was super simple. There's just a chance for them to spawn in the place of the small logs, and I coded it so that if it touches the player, an internal counter counts down, and when it hits 0, it progresses the plank onto the next level of degradation, or the plank disappears if it's at the final stage. I then modified the end screen to have a space to display your score, and I also made a restart button. Of course you could already restart the game by just hitting the green flag, but not having an inbuilt replay button always feels a little bit amateur, so I created that and made it so that it appears on the game over page, and so that clicking it restarts the game. Next I made it so that there's actually a way to earn points, so to speak, and the way you'll do that is by collecting coins. My thought process behind this is that you're some sort of Indiana Jones-esque treasure hunter collecting these rare Aztec coins or something, so I made the art for the coins and added those onto one platform per row, with there being a chance to spawn 2 on some platforms if you're lucky. And I created UI to display the score both in the gameplay section and in the game over screen, coding it so that it repositions onto the correct platform when it switches to the latter. I also coded it so that in the boat sections there's a constant stream of coins for the player to collect, and so that the player can actually collect the coins when they touch them. I then went through and added in a load of sound effects. This is key for the experience in any game. There are sounds for events, I guess you'd call them, such as being eaten by a crocodile, collecting a coin, or getting into or out of a boat. And there are sounds that play on certain frames of the player's animation, like a footstep sound when you're running, or a splash sound on each row of the boat's oars. And then there's just a passive river sound that plays constantly through the game. For sounds like the coin pickup sound that you're going to be hearing a lot in quick succession, I added in a little bit of pitch shifting to make sure that it's not quite so annoying over time. I also made a backing track for the game in Soundtrap, and this is one of the only times where I felt really limited by the instruments available in the free version. I'd have loved to have some of the percussion drums and things to make a proper Aztec-y jungle style themed piece, but I had to make do with what I had, and I think I made what I'd almost describe as a modernized version of a jungle theme, and either way I'm pretty happy with what I came up with, even though I'm far from a musician and my method of writing a melody is to slam my fingers across the keyboard and to try and salvage something workable from whatever ear assaults that leaves behind. And then I added the finished track looping in the background of the game, and for a quick last minute addition I added in some other types of collectible to spawn in the place of the coin on occasion, and these reward the player with more score depending on the rarity of the item, just for a bit of variety. And the very last thing I had to do was to turn the title screen into a thumbnail for the game, and all this had to do was to hide when the game starts code wise, and this marks the game as complete. I'm super happy with how this came out. It's fairly standard as endless runners go, but I certainly think that it's an improvement on the original. Today we're remaking the game The Horror Inside by Digimon 128, which is a horror game where you play as Scratch Cat and have to hide from an evil version of Scratch Cat. Mechanically it's like, well, a lot of games really, but FNAF Into the Pit comes to mind just because that's a recent one that I've actually played. I wasn't sure about remaking this one because while it's a great candidate, nothing against the submission itself, Scratch can be a bit weird about horror games. Basically anything deemed too scary for like a 3-year-old can be axed, but it is spooky season, so I thought I'd throw caution to the wind and give it a go, but I am going to have to steer away from scary while still trying to maintain as much of the tension as possible, so the vibes may actually be quite a bit different from the original project. I started by deleting all of the code, and to be honest I also wound up deleting and remaking most of the sprites as well. I then did some of the animations for Scratch Cat. I did decide that in the spirit of the original I would still use Scratch Cat as the player character rather than creating my own, but I decided to keep the default Scratch Cat's eyes rather than those beady little things that Digimon gave their version, and I changed his insane smile for a kind of toned down small little frown. I had to animate him idling where he just kind of bobs up and down as well as walking and running, and while that's happening I want to quickly address a comment that I got on the last episode of this series from Inky981, just in case anyone has the same query that they did. That's not really fixing it though, this would be creating a better version. Fixing would imply that you've used the game, its code, and made it better. All you've done is make a different game based on the same gameplay. True, I do completely purge the code and assets from these games to remake them into something that I think at least is a little bit better, but I think it comes down to what the point of this series is. I want to teach you how to take an idea, the primary gameplay loop that you have, and turn it into a full game, and I don't want to feel hamstrung by what I'm already given, because sometimes you do have to redo things and go back to the drawing board. Sometimes you do have to kill your darlings to make your vision come together. My objective is to make something in the spirit of the original, not a carbon copy remake, and if that makes fixing your project a bit of a misnomer, then well, at least it's catchy, right? Thank you so much for your comment, Inky, a super valid observation, and if anyone else has something they want me to address in these videos, leave a comment and I'll answer any and all questions that I think require a bit of a deep dive. It gives me something to talk about during these time lapses anyway. And I coded in the movement mechanics. You can move left and right using A and D or using the arrow keys, and you run by holding R and sneak by holding F, and I made sure that it plays the correct animation based on whether the cat is idling or how it's moving. I made the art for 6 different rooms. 5 of these are typical rooms that you'd find in a house, so a living room, bedroom, bathroom, so on. And I added accent colours to each room in a colour that's based on one of the Scratch Bite characters. The living room uses Giga Red, the dining room uses Nano Grey, the kitchen Pico Orange, bedroom Gobo Yellow, and the bathroom Terra Blue. This is because you need to collect an item based on each of these characters from each of the rooms. I also tried to work in some of the Scratch library assets into the background art just because we're playing as the Scratch mascot here, and this was a bit tricky because I needed them to all have roughly the same art style. They all had to be vector art, for instance, and the Scratch library is really varied and inconsistent, but I do think I got some cute stuff into there. I also made a computer room, and this acts as the central hub that you need to get your collectibles back to. I coded it so that you can switch between these rooms by walking to the edges of the screen, and I also realized that I needed backgrounds for hallways. Here you'll be able to take the stairs between the different floors. I then went through the backgrounds and separated out anything that the player can interact with into a separate sprite, I made it so that these clone in whenever you switch to a different room, with any objects associated with the previous room disappearing. And having done this, I could code it so that you can start to interact with these objects, beginning with pressing Q when touching a stairwell to go to the other floor, and I coded in the first puzzle. The basic gameplay loop is basically that of a simple escape room style puzzle, with avoiding the enemy being an added complication. I've made a couple of these escape room style games before, so this was fairly straightforward for me to code, and the first puzzle involves putting a 4-digit code that's written on the wall into a lockbox. This gives you a USB to put into the computer, and doing that gives you the item to start the next chain of puzzles. I wanted everything for the first puzzle to be right in the computer room to ease the player into it and get it to work. I had to set up an inventory hotbar which displays what items you've acquired and allows you to drag these items into the play space to use them, and I also made it so that the game can keep track of the state of objects like the lockbox to tell the game whether or not you've opened it. I went through and coded in the rest of the puzzles, and I won't be breaking these down here or anything because I just don't want to spoil the solutions for you guys. As a rule, I didn't want it to be too difficult because once you're also trying to avoid the enemy, it will inherently be a bit harder. The process of making all of these puzzles was generally just creating some new interactable objects and items if they were ones that I hadn't foreseen needing when I first set these systems up, and making it so that you can find these throughout the house by unlocking various containers. Each puzzle results in getting a USB to take back to the computer, with there being 6 USBs in total, and each puzzle chain progressively getting harder. Why USBs? Well, I decided to add a bit of a theme, and instead of the enemy being just a generically evil looking Scratch cat, I decided to lean in the whole techie coding aspect of Scratch, with the enemy being a glitched version of Scratch Cat stopped by an antivirus that requires the USBs to activate. I made some UI to indicate whether or not you could interact with certain objects, like using stairs or entering a hiding spot, as well as UI to indicate whether or not a container requires an item to open it that might not otherwise be obvious. And I coded it in so that this UI displays correctly. And speaking of the hiding spots, I modified the art for any objects that you could hide in for when you're hiding in them, typically by having some part of the cat peeking out from behind the object, and then coded it so that you can hide in these hiding spots by pressing Q, with the hiding spot switching to the correct costume for when the player is or isn't hidden inside of it. But what's the point of hiding spots without an enemy to hide from? Like I mentioned earlier, I went with a glitched Scratch Cat as the enemy in my game, so I animated idling, walking, and chase animations for it. And to enhance the glitch look, sometimes it switches to a frame from the wrong animation, and all of the animations look super jittery and broken. I wanted the run cycle to feel super heavy, like it almost falls into the next step, especially compared to the player who has a bit of a spring in its step while running, and I set it up so that it switches to the correct costume under a basic state machine. But the AI did of course need to be a lot more complex than that. By default, I needed the enemy to idle in any given room for a while and then walk into the adjacent room where it would continue to idle, rinse, repeat. And if it sees the player, it starts to chase them. If you run into another room, the enemy will chase you into it, provided that it was in the same room as you when you switched rooms. There's a short grace period between it seeing you and starting to chase, just in case you enter a room and wind up right on top of it. And if you hide, the enemy will find you if it was already in the room when you hid, else it becomes confused for a few seconds before going back to idling. I needed to create a fail state for if the glitch catches you, so I made a screen that says you were corrupted on it with a glitching cat face and button to continue. I didn't want the game to completely restart if you get caught, so I made it so that the game saves every time you put a USB into the computer, and then when you get caught it takes you back to that point. This required a lot of adding and pulling values from lists to get working as I wanted it to, and with that done I was able to get the enemy animation and code for catching the player sorted out. I also created a super simple title screen with the name of the game on it, as well as a non-corrupted Scratch Cat head to contrast against the respawn screen. I also had to make a play button for this screen, but I called it load instead of play to reflect the video game simulation aspect of the theming. I wanted to make an opening cutscene, and because in the original project you find out about the horror on the TV, I styled this around a news broadcast, which basically explains the premise of the game, that you have to find 5 USB sticks whilst avoiding the glitched version of Scratch Cat in order to deploy an antivirus to save the day. The news broadcaster is another asset from the Scratch library called Frank that I modified to be wearing a suit instead of overalls and to be holding some paper from behind a news desk. His mouth also moves as the dialogue appears. It took quite a while to copy in all the letters for the text boxes, but I definitely think it was worth it, and I also made a cutscene for when you end the game by putting in the final USB. Now onto the audio portion of the game. I created a backing track in Soundtrap, trying to find a balance between a horror track and keeping a synthy techie 8-bit audio style. I played around with some of the synths that the free version of Soundtrap has to offer, adding some echo and reverb and other more haunting effects, and eventually found something that worked with what I had in my head. And I added it into the game, looping in the background, along with some other sound effects that I either pulled from my old games or the Scratch sound library and modified into what I needed to create the right feedback for the player and to create the right atmosphere. And finally I made a thumbnail for the project. Today we are remaking Kapiton Kot by Micro Brothers. Let's start by breaking down the original game. Kapiton Kot is a top-down space-themed shooter game where you control a small spaceship, destroying rocks while avoiding obstacles such as meteors. It's already pretty fun, however, it does lack a sense of progression. Right now the difficulty stays the same throughout. But based on the unused level select and enemy assets in the game, I do believe that this is something that the original creator did want to address but just never got round to. They also hinted in the submission form that they sent for this project that they wanted to expand the story, so that is something that I will be focusing on. The art in the original game is very charming, and I'll be sticking closer to the original art in this game than in any other one in this series. However, there are some inconsistencies that I want to iron out, especially with outlining and pixel sizes. I started by redrawing the spaceship art. While I kept the overall design intact, the original was a bit large and unwieldy, so I resized it and standardized the pixel dimensions. The original project included 2 spaceship designs, the Bloodhound and the Eagle. I reworked this system into a level up mechanic, creating 5 ship levels, 3 based on the Bloodhound and 2 based on the Eagle. The Eagle ships also include an auto shoot feature, letting you fire continuously by holding the mouse button or spacebar. Next, I tackled the main menu. Again, I stayed close to the original, but I did clean it up for consistency's sake. Here's a quick before and after on that. The original game featured stars that descended from the top of the screen, but didn't actually serve any gameplay function. I integrated these into the gameplay as collectible items that increase your score, adding an extra layer of engagement. Since I focused heavily on building the story, I revamped the dialogue boxes. Instead of using Scratch's default fonts, I drew the letters individually to ensure consistent sizing and to match the retro sci-fi aesthetic. I also introduced new characters, Tiara, a mechanic, and the Scavenger, the game's main antagonist. I also kept Jerry, the original partner character, and gave all the characters animated icons for their dialogue. The story unfolds through dialogue, starting with a tutorial that guides the player through movement, collecting stars and shooting space rocks. The tutorial also introduces the scavengers. I repurposed much of the original project's code here, which was a pleasant surprise. It's rare to find so much salvageable code in these remakes. I set up a shop and level select page, designing icons and UI for the upgrade options. The unused level select sprite from the original project hinted at an 8-level progression system, with the final level being a boss fight, so I honoured that vision. Some levels introduced new mechanics. Level 2, that's meteors that fall from the top of the screen requiring quick dodges. Level 4, power-ups that temporarily boost stats like damage, and level 6, scavenger scouts which fire bullets while moving across the screen. I also added higher level space rocks with more health that drop extra stars when destroyed. These mechanics, combined with upgradable stats like damage, health and regeneration, give the game a much needed sense of progression. The boss fight features 2 alternating phases. In the first, the boss fires bullets directly at the player. In the second, it retreats and sends in scavenger scouts. It's a straightforward but satisfying finale. For the music, I used Soundtrap to create an atmospheric outer space vibe with an 8-bit melody, reflecting the game's retro sci-fi style. For sound effects, I turned to JSLXR, generating a variety of 8-bit sounds that fit perfectly. After implementing these changes, it was all about playtesting, bug fixing and adding in some polish. Honestly, today's episode felt less like fixing your Scratch projects and more like finishing your Scratch project. The original had such a strong foundation, it just needed expanding into a full experience, and I felt confident that's exactly what I delivered. Today we're remaking City Clicker by Penguin Man 2789, aka Xander. For full transparency, I do know Xander personally and even contributed to one of the animations in this project. Beautiful work, by the way. The main reason I'm tackling this project this week is actually for Xander's birthday, so happy birthday, mate. That said, just because we're friends doesn't mean that I won't critique his project, so let's break it down. The core gameplay loop revolves about clicking a big red button to earn points, which you can then spend on buildings in the shop. These buildings increase both your points per click and passive income per second. It's a solid foundation, but I did find the progression a little bit slow. Visually, the game uses an isometric art style defined by Wikipedia as a style in video games where the playfield is viewed at an angle rather than flat from the side or the top. It features bold colours and harsh black outlines with clouds moving in the background. However, I did find the visuals cluttered and inconsistent. Some of my pet peeves were present, such as Scratch's default fonts and variable displays, which I find quite unattractive. The outlines aren't consistently applied across all assets, and the big red button does feel out of place, not well integrated with the rest of the art. But that's the starting point, so let's dive in. I redesigned the game to progress through different cities, starting with New Cairo. My focus was on setting up modular and expandable systems, making it easier to add future cities. For New Cairo, I focused on 4 buildings: a house, a farm, a market and a landmark. Each can be upgraded 3 times, and I maintained the isometric art style with bold outlines, but softened the look with rounded corners and cell shading. Instead of clicking a big red button, you now click the city itself. It is called City Clicker after all. I also coded the system to properly display the city as buildings are constructed. The original shop required clicking a sign to open a large panel in the middle of the screen, which I felt disrupted the gameplay flow. I redesigned it as a row of icons permanently visible along the bottom of the screen, allowing players to buy items without pausing the core gameplay. I reworked the score display, replacing generic points with a more thematic population system. This display also shows population per click and the population per second. To maintain visual consistency, I created a custom number display rather than using Scratch's default variables. Once the core mechanics were in place, I expanded the game with 4 additional cities: New Paris, New London, New Tokyo, and Newer York. Each city introduces new buildings and increases the population multiplier. For example, if you earn 1 population per click in New Cairo, you'd get 2 in Paris and 4 in New London, and so on. Each building required multiple upgrade levels and corresponding shop icons. I added cutscenes between the cities to enhance the progression. Each city meets a unique demise. New Cairo is destroyed by a locust swarm, New Paris falls in a revolution, New London burns to the ground, New Tokyo is consumed by a volcanic eruption, a nod to the original game, and Newer York is obliterated by aliens. After each cutscene, a transition scene introduces the new city's population modifier. I also redesigned the project thumbnail, which will also act as a clean transition scene between the different parts of the game, keeping the original tagline "How far will you go?" but otherwise simplifying the design quite a bit. Here's a before and after on the project thumbnail. For the sound design, I kept most of the original audio as it worked well. Clicking the city plays a pop sound and purchasing from the shop triggers a cash register sound. I also composed a chill background track in Soundtrap. If I had more time, I would have created unique tracks for each city, but for now, 1 track had to suffice. Lastly, I reintroduced the moving clouds in the background, both for visual interest and as a nod to the original design. So from this to this, that's how I remade the project City Clicker by PenguinMan2789. Today we are remaking Slimin Time by Pikachumish. Before we jump into the remake, let's break down the original. Slimin Time is a DDR-based rhythm game similar to Friday Night Funkin', if you're familiar with that. It has a simple, classic gameplay loop and a really effective system for the dialogue. However, the art is quite inconsistent and I feel like the story could be developed further. Another quick note before we start, the original project used copyrighted music for the tracks that the slime dances to, which I won't be using. This does mean that I can't keep quite to the spirit of the original project, but I do find that's unavoidable. I started by refining the primary gameplay loop, creating a slime character that bounces in response to the player's keyboard inputs. I went with a vector art style with bold outlines, as that seemed to be the main style in the original. I also decided on a green monochromatic color palette. For the arrows that tell the player what to press, I made them drop from the top of the screen instead of scrolling along the bottom, as I felt this was easier on the eye and kept the focus on the center of the screen. To expand this into a full game, I created a map to act as a level select screen with icons to differentiate between locked, current and completed levels. I also added a transition screen for seamless movement between the different sections. I really liked the dialogue system in the original project, so I kept mine fairly similar, with a dialogue box displaying the character's name, an icon indicating who's speaking, and letters that type in one by one. I scripted cutscenes to play before each level's first attempt, as well as one at the end of the game. I kept the characters Squish and Grandpa Squash from the original project, and introduced DJ Splash as Squish's rival dancer. With that done, I designed the main menu, basing it on the dance screen but replacing the dancing slime with a slime-shaped play button. After adding a bit more UI to the map, I polished off the gameplay with a fail state screen that includes options to replay the level or return to the map. I also created a game win screen with the only option being to return to the map. Next, I designed all 5 arrow patterns for the levels, introducing 2 new pattern types. One where 2 notes follow in quick succession, and another where 2 notes drop simultaneously. Each level gradually increases in tempo to ramp up the challenge. Finally, I added some sound effects and, instead of a full soundtrack, implemented a rhythmic snare sound with sporadic notes to mimic the feel of a tune that you would hear during the dances. And I wrapped up my work with a project thumbnail. So from this to this, that's how I remade the project Sliming Time by Pikachumish. Today we are remaking Let's Go Fishing by Light Eye Codes. But before we jump into the remake, let's break down the original. As you might have gathered from the name, Let's Go Fishing is a fishing game, where you catch fish by completing a simple timing minigame. There's a lot of good content here, but I would say that this project does suffer a little bit from oversaturation. Light Eye Codes does seem to have taken a bit of a more is more approach with everything from the overabundance of gameplay features, which crowds out the, what I have to say is a pretty good primary gameplay loop, to the animation, which makes it look like you are fishing in the middle of a hurricane. I think that the best thing I can do for this project is to peel back the layers of fluff and make sure that everything I do ties into the primary gameplay loop nice and tightly, and the art in the original is also a little bit all over the place, so I'll be sure to streamline that properly in my version. Starting with the player, I kept the base of a pink square, keeping the vector art style that doesn't use outlines and looks quite cartoony. I didn't add the overalls, as I'll be adding clothing options as unlockable extras later on. I then remade the 10 fish costumes. In the spirit of the original, I didn't change the types of fish, even though some of them, such as the speed fish that looks like a sports car, are a little bit random. I tried to be consistent with the colour palette and art style for all of these. I also made the background for the lake, toning down the rather wild animation, but otherwise keeping it in line with the original. And I also drew the fishing rod in multiple different positions for when you are waiting to cast, when you're waiting for a fish to bite, and when you're trying to reel in a fish. And I remade the space to catch label to instead alternate between saying space and wait, depending on what the player has to do. For any text, I'm writing it in by hand to avoid using Scratch's default fonts. I then set up the primary gameplay loop. For this, you press space to cast the rod, you then wait until a fish bites and then press space again. You then get the timing minigame, which requires you to press space when the oscillating arrow is over the green section of a bar. By having all of this controlled with one key, the space bar, I'm able to keep the game very streamlined. And by changing the size of the green part of the bar and the speed of the arrow, I'm able to control the difficulty of the minigame. In order to expand this out into a full game, I needed to add some things to work towards. To do this, I started by adding money, which racks up as you catch fish, with different fish having different values. The original project already used a custom number display for the score rather than Scratch's default and super unsightly variables, which is great, but I still redid this to bring it in line with the new style. And I made it so that there are more pages than just the fishing page and ways to navigate between them. There's a title screen and an options page that can take you to all of the different windows. I gave the buttons lots of juicy little effects to reflect how dynamic the movement in the original made it, although in a much more controlled manner. For the shop, I created icons for 3 purchase options: rods, bait and luck. Improving the rod unlocks new, more valuable fish, bait makes it easier to catch the fish by slowing down the arrow, and luck makes fish bite more often. Each of these needed a button, with the same mouse over effects as the option pages buttons, and I had to implement the functionality behind each upgrade. I also decided to add a customizable room for you to spend your money on, because this seems to be something that Light Eye Codes wanted to add in the original, and it gives the player something to work towards. And I decided to do the same with outfits for the character. I designed all of the different options for each of these, as well as UI to buy or select the different options and navigate between the different ones. I also threw together a project thumbnail before moving on to the audio side of the project. I made the music in Soundtrap, aiming for a sort of casual, lo-fi, relaxing vibe, as this was the vibe that I got from the music in the original. If you're wondering why I don't just keep the music from the original project, it's because I worry about copyright issues. Here's a quick preview of the final track. And I added this into the background on a loop, along with a myriad of other sound effects to punctuate moments such as catching a fish or buying one of the upgrades. So from this to this, that's how I remade Let's Go Fishing by Light Eye Codes. Today we are remaking Towers by I Hate Me One. And before diving into the remake, let's take a moment to break down the original. Towers is a tower defense game in the style of the mobile game Battle Cat. The gameplay revolves around buying various troops to defend your tower and ideally destroy your opponents in return. It's a solid concept, but so far as I could tell, I Hate Me One hadn't quite figured out how to get enemies to spawn in yet, and visually the game is quite cluttered. The art style is inconsistent, likely due to the fact that multiple artists contributed to the art and their names are on screen now, and some of the art is taken directly from the Scratch library, and that doesn't always fit with the art from the various contributors. So sorry to everyone who made art for the original project, but I am going to have to give this a pretty significant overhaul. I began this process by redesigning the 12 characters you can deploy throughout the game. I chose to retain the highly stylized, cartoony vector art style of the background and use that for the foundation of all my character designs. All the new designs are based around the first character, Cubo, an angry purple rectangle. In the original code, the two factions are referred to as cats versus dogs, but the designs didn't really reflect this, so I scrapped that concept. Instead, I went with a colour-based theme, purple versus yellow. The characters include the aforementioned Cubo, The pilot, who flies a plane and periodically fires small purple bullets, he's the only ranged unit. The robot, the ghost, the pissed melon, which I interpreted as a half piston, half melon hybrid, and the puppy, whose original bear hat was replaced with a top hat to better suit the aesthetic. Rounding out the roster are the glitch, the Dorito, the shark, the zombie, and the bunny, who is based on the original project's Buppet. I also remade the towers to visually reflect the two factions' colours. Next, I created a movement and animation system. Some of the more interesting movement animations include the pilot, shark, ghost, and Dorito, which all float using a sine curve to create a smooth bobbing motion. The pissed melon and bunny bounce as they move. For attacks, the highlights are the Dorito, which winds up before spinning, the shark, which lunges in to bite, and the pissed melon, which emits a small puff of smoke. After that, I added functionality to actually purchase characters. This involved creating a button for each character and a currency display. Once that was in place, I coded it so that clicking a button when you have enough money would spawn that character. I then built a UI to display the health bars for both your tower and the enemies, and I implemented functionality so that characters can deal damage to the opposing base. From there, I made it so characters could damage each other by creating a hitbox during their attacks and checking if it intersected with an enemy unit. As for the enemy characters, I kept it simple. They're just yellow versions of the same characters you can play. This choice was partly because the original enemies were taken from the Scratch library and didn't really inspire me, and partly because it helps players quickly gauge how strong a given enemy is. I also set up the end screen. It uses the same background as the gameplay screen, but with the yellow tower destroyed and some of your troops standing on the rubble. Above them is the text "You won, thanks for playing," and the game cuts to this screen once the enemy's tower reaches 0. To make gameplay more dynamic, I added 4 upgrade options: income per second, starting cash, tower health, and tower regeneration. I set this up similarly to the character shop, and the upgrade screen appears whenever you lose a round. While I was at it, I also threw together a title screen with the play button. At this point, I fancied a bit of a change of pace, so I shifted focus to the game's audio. I started by composing a backing track in Soundtrap. I wanted everything to be built around a steady drum beat with a melody that alternates between a high line and a low line, almost like the music itself is mimicking the in-game battle. I also added a variety of sound effects to enhance the character movements and attacks. Finally, I wrapped up the last of the gameplay features, such as making sure that the pilot's bullets function properly and ensuring the overall difficulty was well balanced. So from this to this. That's how I remade Towers by I Hate Me One. Because this is part 10 of my series, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different and a little bit special. You send me a lot of projects, and I want to remake as many of them as I can, but some of the projects are just a bit too small to warrant a full video and just don't have enough content to fill out the episode. So today I'm going to be taking 3 smaller projects and combining them into one big arcade project. This is something that you chose on my Discord via a poll, and the idea of turning them into an arcade project was something that was suggested by JTW789. Before getting into any of the remakes, I started by setting up a title screen for the base project. I added a play button and I wanted it to feel dynamic, so I used a sign of timer script to make it swing back and forth unless it's touching the mouse. If it is, the button straightens out, enlarges, and becomes brighter. When pressed, it shrinks and darkens. This makes interacting with the button really satisfying. I also built a menu where you can select which of the 3 games to play, creating an icon for each in the same style as the play button. These 3 game select buttons have the same mouse over effects, and I set it up so that when a play button is pressed, it fades out and the game select buttons fade in. Each game select button triggers a description pop-up on hover. This shows the game's title and the Scratch user who originally made it. Speaking of which, the 3 projects I'll be remaking this week are Candy Chaos by Platformer Man 123, Frog Target by Gumpy, and Fireball by It's Windy Codes. For the main menu music, I created a track in Soundtrap using a simple setup, a drum for the beat, a guitar for the melody, and a faint bass line in the background. Since each minigame has its own track, I couldn't just loop the background music like I normally would. Instead, I built a music manager that allows the audio to fade in and out depending on what's currently open. I also added some satisfying button click sounds to round it all out. But moving on to game 1, Candy Chaos by Platformer Man 123. The original Candy Chaos game is a simple minigame where you move an object along the bottom of the screen and catch falling items. Healthy foods increase your score, candy decreases it, and non-food items cause an instant game over. While the core mechanics are fun, the art could use a revamp, and the theme felt a bit odd. For a game called Candy Chaos, it felt odd that the candy was bad, so I flipped the concept now. Candy is good, fruit is bad, and bombs are the new instant fail items. This aligned better with the revised tone and made the gameplay more intuitive. Platformer Man had also requested bombs in their submission, so that helped justify the change from random non-food items like Lego bricks or shovels to bombs as the main hazard. I started with a tutorial page to explain the controls and gameplay. Players use A and D or the arrow keys to move the platform. Since I dislike Scratch's default fonts, I hand drew each letter, which gives the text a cute cartoony aesthetic that I love. Next, I set up the core mechanics, a sprite to spawn falling items and a player-controlled platform. I added momentum to the movement so the platform gradually slows down when a key is released rather than stopping suddenly. The difficulty ramps up over time with items spawning faster and dropping more quickly, and an increasing percentage of bombs and fruit appearing. I also set up a UI to show the player's score. I created a sprite to display the digits 0 to 9 and wrote code to display the score variable correctly, including edge cases like negative values or scores over 999, which couldn't be displayed with the available costumes. To finish this first game, I created a new bubbly upbeat track in Soundtrap. Thanks to the music manager I'd set up earlier, I just uploaded the audio and it played automatically at the right time. I also added sound effects for when collecting different objects to enhance the feel of the game. So from this to this. That's how I remade Candy Chaos by Platformer Man 123. So on to game 2, Frog Target by Gumpy. To be completely honest, Frog Target was already a lot of fun. The movement is satisfying and pretty addictive. The main issue was the lack of theming. The red targets don't tie into the frog at all and the plain white background felt unfinished. Being able to include it in a larger styled project gave it a stronger visual identity automatically. And also it's very difficult to lose at the game. Every time you collect targets, the timer goes up, so I found myself able to play and hover around the same score for several minutes. I created a tutorial page to explain the controls and mechanics. Since the original was already polished, I focused on adding in a few new elements, flies that act like moving targets and give you extra score, and bombs that cause an instant game over, tying into the previous minigame. I kept key features from the original, like how going off one side of the screen teleports you to the other, and how the frog spins while moving. A lot of the code from Candy Chaos was reusable here, which really helped speed things up. All I needed to wrap this one up was a new backing track. I went with an Oriental inspired melody as a nod to the frog's kawaii style in the original. Because I reused a lot of the earlier code, the sound effects were already in place, so I didn't need to do any extra work here. So from this to this, that's how I remade Frog Target by Gumpy. So on to game 3, Fireball by It's Windy Codes. In Fireball, you move around the screen collecting coins while dodging fireballs. The gameplay is already solid, but the player's movement did feel a bit sluggish, and I wasn't entirely sure what the energy meter in the corner was for. I started with a tutorial screen to explain the controls. The only major change I made was adding a speed boost power-up, something that It's Windy Codes specifically requested in their form. Other than that, I kept the gameplay close to the original. Since the original character was a square, I kept that design. I reused the movement code from Frog Target, but removed the spinning animation and just made the square face the direction it's moving. For the fireballs, I used the If on Edge bounce block for probably the first time. It worked perfectly. I also kept the nice trail effect from the original since it added a great visual touch. For the music, I composed a dramatic track that feels like a battle music to reflect the tension of dodging fireballs. With the music manager already in place, again integrating it with simple. So from this to this, that's how I remade Fireball by It's Windy Codes. After a bit of routine bug fixing, I put together a project thumbnail and shared everything to Scratch. Oh, and since this is part 10, here's a little secret. With the exception of the first project, for obvious reasons, I included an Easter egg referencing the previous game in each new project I've made for this series. They're pretty hard to find, but props if you managed to. Or I guess you could just check the code and see where they are, but where's the fun in that? But apart from that, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did. It lets me know that this is something you want to see more of. Join the Discord, link down below, and I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!